For 3 solid days, Aaron could only watch as his home burned. Through the station's main viewport, another city vanished in a silent, blinding flash of light. The Cravath weren't just winning, they were systematically erasing his entire civilization, and he was helpless to do a thing about it. What would you do if you knew your whole world had just hours left? Drop your answer in the comments below, because Aaron was fresh out of ideas. Inside the council chamber, half the seats were hauntingly empty, a tribute to the leaders they'd already lost. "Give me a fleet update," Aaron said, his voice feeling distant. Lisa's hands were shaking as she stared at her screen. "We have 17 defense cruisers left, plus maybe 40 patrol ships. Against the Cravath's armada of over 300 warships, it wasn't a battle. It was a death sentence. The Dolin were never soldiers. They were explorers, scientists, and artists. Their ships were built to chart new star systems and guard trade lanes, not to wage a galactic war. The Cravath, however, lived for conquest, having carved a bloody empire across the galaxy for centuries. "What about the evacuation ships?" Aaron asked, turning to his chief scientist. "The last one jumped out an hour ago," Lisa said, her voice barely a whisper. "We got about 40,000 people out before they blockaded the system." The silence that followed was suffocating. "That leaves 12 million people on the planet. 12 million souls about to be extinguished because he had failed them. He'd tried negotiations. He'd even offered to surrender. The Cravath commander had just laughed at him. They didn't want the planet or its resources. They wanted to make an example of the Dolin, a warning to the rest of the galaxy about what happens when you stand up to them." Suddenly, the whole station shuddered from a nearby blast. Red emergency lights bathed the room in a grim glow as another cruiser icon disappeared from the tactical map, taking 200 more of his people with it. "Commander Drexen is on the line again," the comms officer reported, his face pale. Aaron straightened his back. "Put him through." The face that filled the screen was that of a born predator. Drexen had the reptilian skin, 4 cold, unblinking eyes, and a mouth full of needle-sharp teeth that his species was known for. He was smiling. "Well, Counselor Aaron, have you finally decided to be sensible and offer me your unconditional surrender?" Aaron's voice was ice. "We both know there's nothing left for me to surrender. You've made sure of that." Draysen's smile widened. "I know, but I still want to hear you say it. I want to hear the leader of the great Dolin Republic admit you are nothing but a speed bump on our road to glory. You should have taken our offer to join the Dominion when you had the chance. We refused because we don't believe in being slaves." "Slaves, subjects, it's all just words," Drexen sneered. "The only thing that's real is strength, and you are weak. And we always win." He leaned closer to the camera, his voice dropping to a conspiratorial whisper. "Your sad little fleet will be scrap metal in less than an hour. After that, my soldiers will pay your cities a visit. I hear Dolin are fragile. My troops are excited to test that theory." Aaron struggled to keep his fury in check. "There are galactic treaties. The Council has laws against targeting civilians." "The Galactic Council is 3 months away, and they don't have the guts to stand up to the Dominion," Drexen mocked. "By the time they finish drafting a strongly worded letter, your entire species will be nothing but a footnote in a history book." The transmission ended, plunging the room into a heavy silence. Every single person was staring at Aaron, their eyes pleading for a miracle he couldn't provide. "Counselor," Lisa began, her voice barely audible. There might be one last option, one final desperate move we haven't tried." "What is it? We've gone over everything." "The ancient beacon." The words hung in the air, sending a shiver down Aaron's spine. It was more of a legend than a real plan, a relic from an age before his people even knew how to leave their planet. It was an enormous, mysterious device left behind by the mythical Old Ones, the first race to ever achieve faster-than-light travel before they vanished without a trace 10,000 years ago. "That beacon hasn't been activated in recorded history," Aaron argued. "We don't even know if it still works." "The archives claim it's a universal distress call," Lisa pressed, bringing up a hologram of glowing ancient symbols. "It sends out a plea for help in every known language, on every frequency, across the whole galaxy." "A plea to who? The old ones are gone, Lisa." "I know," she said, tapping a specific section of the text. "But the archives mention something else. They talk about those who slumber in the dark voids and the guardians from the world of death. The old ones seem to believe that if the call was ever answered, it would be by them." "That's a children's story, Lisa." "Maybe it is," she said, her eyes begging him to reconsider. "But what else can we do? We're already dead, Aaron. At least this way, we don't go quietly." Another explosion rocked the station, this one close enough to knock them off their feet. The Krevath were moving in for the final strike. Aaron's decision was instant. Do it. Light it up. They sprinted through empty hallways to a chamber 3 levels down, a place he hadn't set foot in since a childhood field trip. In the middle of the room sat a massive crystalline monolith, pulsing with a faint inner light, like the heartbeat of a sleeping god. Lisa ran to a dusty control panel, her fingers dancing across surfaces that hadn't been touched in millennia. A low, powerful hum started to vibrate through the floor, a sound you could feel deep in your chest. "Is it on?" Aaron shouted over the rising noise. "I think so. The translation just says it broadcasts continuously once powered. It won't stop until it gets a reply, or we lose power." "How long is the power grid going to last?" "At this rate, about 3 years. 3 years of screaming for help into an empty void, hoping someone might hear." Aaron knew they wouldn't even last the next 3 hours. On the chamber's view screen, they watched the final moments of the battle. Their last few ships fought with incredible bravery, but they were being systematically torn to pieces. As Aaron and Lisa saw their last defenders get wiped out, the beacon behind them pulsed with energy, sending its silent scream out into the cold, empty darkness. But far away in a forgotten corner of the galaxy, something heard that scream. And on a small blue planet that everyone else had tried to ignore, an alarm started blaring. Admiral Helen Cross was bored out of her mind. She was stuck in her office at United Earth Defense Command, drowning in logistics reports that a lieutenant should have been filing. But that was the price of peace. Humanity's mighty fleet spent its days on pointless patrols, guarding a border that no one ever tried to cross. 200 years ago, when humanity first mastered faster-than-light travel, the Galactic Council had welcomed them with open arms, and then promptly drew a quarantine line around their entire solar system. They called it a cultural observation period. The real reason? Humanity scared the hell out of every other species they had met. A sharp chime from her desk terminal shattered the quiet. It was a top priority alert from the Deep Space Listening Post on Pluto. "Admiral, you need to see this. We're picking up a signal, but it's like nothing we've ever logged. It's on all frequencies, in thousands of languages, including flawless English." Helen leaned forward, her boredom instantly vanishing. "What's the message?" "It's a distress call, ma'am. The tech is ancient, but insanely powerful. It's coming from the outer spiral arm about 800 light-years away." The computer translated it. "It's from a civilization called the Doline Republic. They say they're being wiped out and are begging for help from anyone who can hear them." "The Doline? I've never heard of them." "They're not in our records, Admiral. According to the galactic charts we have, their territory is on the other side of Council space, way beyond the line we're not supposed to cross." A fire Helen hadn't felt in years suddenly sparked to life inside her. "Get me President Garcia on a secure channel right now, and I want every scrap of data we have on that entire sector." 20 minutes later, Helen stood in the command center with the President and Joint Chiefs watching the main view screen. Counselor Aaron's desperate voice filled the room. "Our home is being destroyed by the Creveth Dominion. Our fleet is gone. Millions of our people are being slaughtered. We're sending this message with the hope that someone, anyone, will hear our plea. Please, if there is anyone out there who still believes in peace, who believes in justice, we're begging you, help us. We don't have much time." The recording looped, the plea of a ghost echoing across the stars. "The Creveth Dominion," an intelligence officer reported. "They're a big problem, a brutal military power that's conquered about 40 systems. The Council is too afraid of them to lift a finger." President Garcia looked straight at Helen. "If we decided to go, could we even make it in time? If we deploy our fastest ships right now, we can be there in 72 hours. But ma'am, the Council will view this as an act of aggression. They told us to stay in our corner of the galaxy. So do we need anyone's permission to answer an SOS? Legally, not a soul. There's an ancient galactic law that says any species with the means to help has to respond to a legit distress call. But we'd be the first ones to ever actually use it." Garcia just stared at the star map, at that tiny, faraway dot called the Doline Republic, all alone and about to be wiped out. How many ships can you get into the sky? It was the question Helen had been waiting to hear for her entire career. A grim smile flickered across her face. "Give me 4 hours and I can have 6 battle fleets ready to go. That's 36 heavy cruisers, 72 destroyers, and 200 support ships." She paused, letting the numbers sink in. Plus the Ragnarok. The room went dead silent. Everyone knew the stories about the Ragnarok, the secret, experimental dreadnought humanity built with forbidden tech, a ship so powerful the Galactic Council thought it was too dangerous to even exist. It was, without a doubt, the single biggest warship humanity had ever dreamed up, packed with weapons that would make the so-called civilized races of the galaxy turn pale. "Do it, Garcia," the Admiral commanded. "Send everything. I want every last ship we have out there." Helen, the communications officer, couldn't stop the massive grin spreading across her face. "Yes, ma'am." 4 hours later, Admiral Helen Cross stood on the command bridge of her flagship, the UEES Valiant. Through the huge viewport, she watched her fleet assemble in perfect formation, a beautiful dance of steel and fire that was the result of 2 centuries of non-stop training. Humanity hadn't seen a real war in generations, but they had never, ever forgotten how to fight. Her second-in-command, Captain Dan Reed, walked onto the bridge. He was young for a captain, only 35, but he'd more than earned his rank in countless war games. More than that, he was one of the few officers left who truly believed in why the fleet existed in the first place. "Admiral, all ships are reporting green. We are ready to leave on your command." "Good," she said, her voice like steel. "Send a message to the Dolin. Let them know help is on the way. Then get us moving." In a blinding flash of blue energy, the entire fleet simply disappeared. Behind them, Earth was just a quiet blue marble. Ahead of them was a rescue mission that could change the galaxy forever. They were only 3 hours into their trip when an urgent message came screaming in from Galactic Council headquarters. The face of Ambassador Thesson, a tall bird-like creature whose job was to keep humanity in check, materialized on the main screen. He looked like he was about to have a panic attack. "Admiral Cross, we see your fleet's warp signature. You have to turn around right now." "We're responding to a distress signal, Ambassador. Galactic law is perfectly clear on this matter." "You don't understand," he chirped, his voice cracking under the strain. "The Dolin situation is an internal Dominion issue. The Kravoth have laid claim to that territory. The Council has already voted to stay out of it." Helen's jaw clenched. "Then it's a good thing we're not part of the Council, aren't we?" "Admiral, please." The ambassador's feathers were all puffed out, a sign of pure terror. "Your entire species was put in quarantine for a very good reason. You come from a death world. Do you have any idea what that actually means? Your planet's gravity is almost double the galactic standard. Your weather patterns are catastrophic. Your predators would be classified as biological weapons on most civilized worlds. You are literally built to survive in a place that would kill most of us in minutes." "I'm aware of Earth's classification," she said, her voice ice cold. "Then you have to know that the second you show up in Dolin space, you will scare them half to death, and when you fight the Kravoth of Earth, you will horrify them. The way humanity wages war, it's deeply disturbing to the rest of the galaxy. You use solid metal slugs, chemical explosives, and tactics that rely on an endurance for pain that other species can't even begin to imagine. We didn't quarantine you because you're monsters. We quarantined you because we have no idea how to deal with a species of natural-born warriors who won't play by our polite little rules." Helen could feel her anger starting to boil. "So you would rather just sit back and watch millions of innocent beings get slaughtered than risk us upsetting a few of your delicate friends?" The ambassador squeezed his eyes shut, totally defeated. "I'm trying to warn you. After this, you can't go back. The galaxy will finally see what humanity is truly capable of, and they will be terrified of you." "Let them be," Helen snapped back. "We're going." "Then I'll pray the Dolin survive what's coming," Thesson whispered. "And I'll pray the rest of us can survive the knowledge that the humans have finally been unleashed." The transmission ended. Dan looked over at Helen, his expression worried. "You think he's right? That we'll scare them?" "Probably," she admitted without hesitation. "But people are dying, Dan, and they called us for help. That's the only thing that matters." She turned back to the star-filled view ahead.
Besides, maybe it's about time the galaxy got a real lesson in who we are.
We might come from a death world, but that doesn't make us monsters. It just makes us really, really good at protecting people who need it. The fleet sliced through the silent darkness, 72 hours to save a species they'd never even met. 72 hours to prove the quarantine was the galaxy's biggest mistake. 72 hours until everyone found out what happens when you poke a sleeping giant. When the human fleet dropped out of warp at the edge of Doline space, it was like a legion of ghosts appearing out of nowhere. Counselor Aaron was deep inside the emergency command bunker when a brand new alarm started blaring. His people had already learned to distinguish the siren for another Cravath bombing run from the one that meant something else. This was the something else alarm.
Counselor, we're detecting massive energy signatures on the edge of the system. Scans are showing 38 capital-class ships and over 200 smaller ones. Their design is totally unknown. Their technology is unidentifiable, but they are not Cravoth. Aaron's heart felt like it was going to pound right out of his chest. The beacon. Somebody had actually answered their last desperate prayer. Are they on our side? We have no idea. They're just holding their position in a tight defensive formation. Wait a second. We're getting a hail. Audio only. The voice that boomed through the bunker was nothing like Aaron had ever heard. Even with the universal translator, he could feel its raw power, its absolute, unshakable confidence. This is Captain Dan Reed of the United Earth ship Valiant. We are responding to your distress signal. We are here to help. Please confirm you can receive this message. Earth. Aaron searched his memory but found nothing. Lysa, check the records. Is there anything at all about a species called humans from a planet called Earth? Lysa's fingers were already a blur on her console. Nothing in the modern database, sir. Let me try the ancient archives, the ones from the time of the first ones. A second later, she gasped. I found a single reference. It's filed under mythology. It talks about the sleepers from the death world of Terra. She looked up from her screen, her eyes as wide as saucers. Terra is an old name for Earth. The file says they were guardians, beings who lived in the forgotten darkness between the stars. That's all it says. The first ones met them only once and immediately declared their entire solar system off limits. The classification is Death World, Class 12. Class 12? A cold dread washed over Aaron. He'd never even heard of a classification higher than 8. What in the stars does Class 12 mean? Lisa looked as pale as a ghost. It means the planet is so hostile, so deadly, that even thinking about visiting it is officially classified as an act of suicide. Counselor, I think we might have just called on something much, much worse than the Cravoth. But they were already dead. Aaron made a decision. Open a channel. Captain Reed, this is Counselor Aaron of the Dolan Republic. We receive you. Are you really here to help us? The voice on the other end was perfectly calm and steady. That's the only reason we came. We picked up your call 3 days ago and got here as fast as our ships could fly. Tell me what's going on. Aaron explained everything. The brutal Cravath invasion, the non-stop orbital bombardment, the millions who were already dead, and the final ground assault that was only hours away. On his tactical map, he watched as the unknown ships began to move, spreading out into an attack formation. Understood,
Reed said when he was done. "We're going to help you, but you need to be prepared for what you're about to see. We will engage the Cravath, and the fighting is going to get intense."
Our methods might seem brutal to you, but I give you my word that we will not let them harm another one of your people. Do we have your permission to engage? Yes, please, just do whatever you have to do. Thank you. One last thing. Keep your ships well away from the combat zone. We don't want any friendly fire incidents. There was a short pause. It looks like the Cravath are hailing us now. This should be interesting. Commander Drexen had been enjoying a glass of fine spirits to celebrate his impending victory. His troops were all set for the final ground invasion. And then this unknown fleet had to show up. At first, he was annoyed. Now, he was just entertained. Unidentified vessels. This is Commander Drexen of the Cravath Dominion. You are interfering in a sovereign military operation. Identify yourselves and your purpose, then leave this system at once. This is Captain Reed of the United Earth Fleet. We're here answering a distress call from the Dolin Republic. You're the one who needs to power down your weapons and withdraw. Drexen actually laughed out loud. Earth never heard of it. You must be some primitive species from the outer rim that doesn't understand how the galaxy works. This system belongs to us now. Get out of here, or we'll turn you into space dust. I gave you a chance to walk away, Reed's voice replied, completely flat. Don't forget that. The channel cut out. Still smiling, Drexen ordered 3 of his battle groups to move in and completely annihilate the newcomers. It was supposed to be an easy cleanup, 30 top-of-the-line warships against a bunch of nobodies. Commander Drexen smirked as his Cravath fleet surged forward, their plasma cannons humming with power, ready to slice through primitive armor like it was tissue paper. His targeting systems painted the enemy ships. He leaned back, ready for the fireworks. But then the humans fired first. Drexen's smile vanished. The tactical display lit up like a nightmare. These primitives, they weren't using energy weapons. They were firing solid chunks of metal from railguns and launching missiles with explosive tips. Weapons the rest of the galaxy had outlawed centuries ago for being too savage, too barbaric. And they were brutally effective. One of his cruisers took 3 railgun slugs to the front. Its energy shields might as well have been glass. The metal slugs tore through the armor plate and just kept going, punching gaping holes clean through the ship. The cruiser snapped in 2, venting its crew and its atmosphere into the silent void. Drexen stared in utter disbelief as his fleet was ripped to shreds. The human weapons were absolutely devastating. Another of his destroyers took a direct hit from a single, ugly-looking missile that buried itself deep in the engine room before it went off. The explosion was so bright it made Drexen's eyes water, even on the monitor. "Return fire!" Drexen roared. "All ships, focus on their lead vessel!" The Cravath fleet obeyed. A storm of superheated plasma screamed across the void, a wave of pure energy that should have vaporized anything it touched. The human flagship took the entire blast head-on. Drexen leaned forward, expecting to see the ship peel apart, but it didn't. Where the plasma hit, the human ship's armor just glowed white-hot. Huge sections melted away, only to reveal a second layer of solid armor underneath. The ship never slowed down, never stopped firing. It soaked up a blow that would have shattered any other vessel and just kept coming. What in the stars are those ships made of?
someone on his bridge whispered. The entire battle was over in just 14 minutes. When the chaos subsided, 30 of Drexen's Krebath ships were floating wreckage. The humans hadn't lost a single vessel. A few of their ships were scarred, but every last one was still ready to fight. On the human bridge, Captain Dan watched the enemy icons disappear. Good, he thought. Maybe now they'll listen. Captain, the Krebath commander is hailing us again. On screen, Drexen's face appeared, his arrogance replaced with pure, unadulterated shock. What are you? He stammered. We're humans, Dan replied, his voice calm. We're from a planet called Earth, and we have a zero-tolerance policy for bullies. You use primitive kinetic weapons and explosives. Your ships have no proper shielding. You fight like barbarians. No, Dan corrected him gently. We fight like people with something to protect. Now I'm giving you one last chance. Stand down, leave this system now or we'll make you leave. I have 300 ships, Drexen blustered, but his voice shook. And we took out 30 of them in less than 15 minutes, Dan countered. Do you really want to see what happens when we get serious? He leaned closer to the camera, his voice dropping. Here's something you need to understand, Commander. On Earth we have a saying, never corner something meaner than you. You started a fight with the Dolphin, a peaceful people. That was your first mistake. Your second mistake was still being here when we answered their call for help. Drexen's 4 eyes stared at Dan like he was a ghost. The entire galaxy will hear of this. Good, Dan said with a nod. Let them. Let everyone know that when someone cries for help, Earth answers. Now, get out. The connection ended. Dan watched as the Krebath fleet slowly and nervously began to retreat. Well, most of them. Drexen hadn't tucked tail and fled just yet, but his fleet was now moving with a caution that bordered on fear. They'd learned a valuable lesson in respect. Captain, the comms officer said, we're getting a call from the Dolphin. Counselor Aaron wants to know our next move. Dan looked down at the planet below. It was scarred and burning, but its people weren't broken. Tell him we're just getting started. Miles away, Colonel Ann Price stared out the window of her drop pod at the Dolphin homeworld. She could see their cities, some miraculously whole, others just smoking craters. The Krebath had landed their occupation forces 2 days ago and now held almost 40% of the planet. That was about to change. All units, this is Colonel Price. We're about to teach these Krebath what happens when you invade someone's home. Remember your training. Remember why you're here. And don't forget that every civilian we rescue is a victory. The drop pods shot from the human carriers in massive waves, 2,000 Marines in the first wave, with 5,000 more right behind them. The pods were designed to look like missiles on Krebath sensors. By the time the invaders realized what was actually coming down, it would be far too late. Anne felt that familiar lurch in her stomach as the pod hit the atmosphere, bucking and rattling. The heat shields glowed a fierce cherry red. Then the retro rockets roared to life, and the pod slammed into the ground, cracking the concrete beneath it. The door blasted open, and Anne was moving before the smoke cleared. They had landed right in a city park. Krebath troops were everywhere. They'd been using the park as a staging area, never dreaming of an attack from the sky. Anne brought her rifle up and fired. Humans had a few natural advantages most aliens didn't grasp until it was too late. Earth's heavy gravity meant that on lighter gravity worlds, every human was stronger and faster. Next to the Krebath, they moved like blurs of lightning. She crossed the park in seconds, her rifle firing in short, controlled bursts. Every shot found its target. The Krabath scrambled to fight back, but they were hopelessly outmaneuvered. Anne's squad hit them from 3 sides at once, using tactics the Krabath had never seen before. They didn't just stand there and trade blaster fire like civilized soldiers. They used cover. They used flanking maneuvers. They were always moving, a whirlwind of deadly force that was impossible to track. A Krabath officer tried to rally his soldiers, and Anne put 2 rounds in his chest for the effort. He dropped like a sack of potatoes. The rest of his squad broke and ran. The Marines gave chase. "Command, this is Price. Landing zone secure. Beginning to sweep the city." High in orbit, Admiral Cross conducted this violent symphony. The Navy was handling the space battle while the Marines took apart the ground forces piece by piece. It was a 2-front war the Krabath were completely unprepared for. Drexen had bet everything on his ground invasion, leaving his ships in orbit outnumbered and outgunned. Meanwhile, his ground troops were being systematically erased by an enemy that fought with a ferocity they simply couldn't match. "Commander, casualty reports are coming in from the surface," an officer said, his voice trembling. "The human ground forces, they're unstoppable." Drexen pulled up the combat feed, and a chill went down his spine. Human soldiers moved through the city with terrifying purpose, clearing entire buildings in minutes. They set up lethal ambushes that his troops walked right into, and they never, ever stopped. One clip showed a human Marine taking 3 hits. The soldier fell. Drexen watched, expecting him to be out of the fight. But he wasn't. The Marine just got back up. His armor had stopped 2 of the shots, and the 3rd had passed clean through his shoulder. The human just slapped a med patch on the wound and kept on fighting. "They don't stop," one of Drexen's officers whispered in horror. "You shoot them and they just keep coming." Anne and her squad finally made it to a Dolphin hospital the Krabath were using as a command post. The worst part? They had civilians inside. Hostages. This required a different approach. "All right, listen up," Anne told her team. "We're going in quiet. No explosives, no heavy weapons. We get the civilians out first, then we clean house." The Marines found a maintenance tunnel and slipped into the building, moving like ghosts despite all their gear. They had spent years training for every environment imaginable. The Krabath sentries patrolling the hospital corridors never stood a chance. They were used to a galaxy that fought with loud, flashy energy weapons. They weren't prepared for opponents who moved like ghosts. Anne's Marine squad had trained in the harshest environments Earth had to offer: sweltering jungles, barren deserts, and Arctic ice fields. They took down the guards with silenced rounds and combat knives, moving with a brutal, silent efficiency that was terrifyingly professional. 3 floors were completely clear before any alarm was raised. They found the civilians packed into the dark, damp basement. Nearly 200 Dolphin, mostly mothers and their children, were huddled together, their eyes wide with fear. Anne slid her helmet off, letting the soft light catch her features. "We're here to get you out," she said, her voice low and calm. "Just stick close to my team and stay as quiet as you can." A tiny Dolphin girl, who looked to be about 6 in human years, stared up at her, tears streaming down her face.
"Are you the Guardians? From the old stories?" Anne managed a small, tired smile.
"Something like that. Come on," she urged them gently. "Let's get you folks to safety." The evacuation was a masterclass in controlled speed, taking just 20 minutes. The Marines guided all 200 civilians through maintenance tunnels to where the Dolphin emergency services were waiting. Once the last child was safe, they turned around and went back into the hospital. That's when the Krebath commander realized his terrible mistake. Every exit had been sealed. His communications were cut. He was trapped. Anne's voice, amplified and unfeeling, echoed from the building's internal speakers. "Surrender now, and you will receive the protections of the galactic rules of war. If you resist, you will be eliminated. You have 2 minutes to make your choice." The commander chose to fight. It was the last mistake he would ever make. The Marines breached the command center from 4 directions at once. The room erupted in blinding light and choking smoke as flashbangs and grenades went off. The Krebath soldiers panicked, firing their weapons blindly into the chaos. But the humans, equipped with thermal imaging, could see every one of them perfectly. The firefight was over in 90 seconds. Anne stood over the Krebath commander, who was on the floor wounded but alive. "You're going to answer for everything you did here," she informed him. "Every civilian you harmed, every law you broke. You'll face a trial for all of it." The commander spat on the floor. "Humans don't play by the rules. You're nothing but savages." "No," Anne corrected him calmly. "We're just much, much better at this than you are. There's a difference." She nodded to her squad. "Get him and the others to the detention area. Make sure the medics see to their wounds. We are not them." The fight for the planet would go on for another 18 hours. When it was over, the Krebath invasion force was completely shattered. Some gave up. Others made a desperate run for their ships, only to be vaporized by the waiting Navy fleet. The rest fought to their last breath and died for a lost cause. High in orbit, Admiral Cross scanned the casualty reports. 37 Marines wounded, with 5 killed in the line of duty. The Krebath, however, had lost more than 10,000 soldiers on the ground and 50 ships in space. Dan stood at her side on the bridge of the flagship, the Valiant. "The Ragnarok is ready, Admiral," she reported. The Ragnarok. They had kept it out of the main fight, their ace in the hole. But Drexen, the Krebath fleet admiral, still had his main battle group of over 100 heavy cruisers. He was retreating, but he hadn't surrendered. "Give him a reason to," Helen said, her voice steady as stone. The Ragnarok glided into view on the main screen. It wasn't a ship. It was a beast, easily double the size of any other vessel in the human fleet. Its primary weapon was a spinal-mounted mass accelerator that stretched the entire length of its massive hull, designed to fire a 10-ton slug at a terrifying percentage of the speed of light. The targeting system locked onto the Krebath formation. Helen gave the command. The Ragnarok fired. The projectile crossed the vast emptiness of space in a heartbeat. It struck the lead Krebath dreadnought right in its core. The kinetic force was so overwhelming that the warship didn't explode. It simply ceased to exist. But the slug wasn't finished. It tore through a second dreadnought, then a third, a fourth, a fifth, and a sixth. 6 capital ships, erased in a single, silent flash. From the bridge of his own flagship, Drexen watched the impossible unfold. A sensation he had never known in his long military career washed over him. Pure, stomach-churning terror. He slammed his fist on the comms panel. "All ships cease fire! I said stand down!" He scrambled to open a line to the human fleet. "We surrender," he managed to choke out, his voice trembling. Unconditionally, we surrender. Just please make it stop. Dan's face appeared on the view screen, her expression like granite. Power down your weapons. Prepare to be boarded. Any deviation will result in your immediate and total annihilation. Do you understand? Drexen could only nod, his throat too tight to speak. Yes, perfectly. The channel closed. Dan turned to Helen. It's over. We won. Helen looked down at the scarred planet below, a world that was bruised and broken, but finally free. No, she said softly. They won. We just leveled the playing field. Down on the planet's surface, Aaron picked his way through the rubble of his city. Human Marines were everywhere, not as conquerors, but as rescuers. He watched one team carefully digging through a collapsed building, gently pulling survivors from the wreckage. He saw a human medic treating a small, injured dolphin child with the same care she would give her own. Lissa found him there, standing in the ruins. The beacon, it actually worked, she whispered in disbelief. The guardians from the stories, they're real. They're not guardians, Lissa. They're soldiers, Aaron replied, his eyes fixed on a young Marine barely 20 years old, carrying an elderly Deline woman to a medical tent. But maybe, he added with a faint smile, that's exactly what a guardian is. The story of what happened in Deline space shot across the galaxy like a bolt of lightning. Ambassador Thesson watched the Galactic Council chamber descend into absolute chaos. Delegates from 200 species were on their feet, shouting, accusing, and demanding answers about the events that had just unfolded in some forgotten stretch of the galaxy. The battle footage was on its third replay on the main display. Human warships slicing through the Kraboth fleet with brutal grace. Human Marines moving through urban wreckage like apex hunters. And then the final, chilling image, the human supership, Ragnarok, unleashing its incredible weapon, wiping out 6 enemy flagships in one silent, devastating shot. Every representative in that room watched with a different reaction. Some saw it with horror, others with a sense of awe. And for a small, desperate few, it looked like a glimmer of hope. This is exactly what we have always feared, bellowed Councillor Van of the Peltherin Union. The humans have demonstrated a military capacity that shatters our most dire predictions. Their weapons are barbaric. Their methods are excessively brutal. They threaten the very stability of our galactic community. They also saved millions of lives, a calmer voice interjected. It was Councillor Mira of the Helen Federation. The Kreveth were committing genocide, and this council did nothing but talk. Earth heard a call for help and prevented a massacre. How can you call that a threat? Because they're from a death world. Van's voice was shrill with panic. Do you not understand what that means? They evolved on a planet where everything was actively trying to kill them. Their world has almost twice the standard gravity. Their storms could level our cities in minutes. Their native predators would give our most elite soldiers nightmares. They are forged for violence in a way we can't even comprehend. At last, Ambassador Thesson stood up. I was the one who warned Earth against this. I told them that the galaxy would judge them for their ferocity, but I was missing a critical piece of the puzzle. He displayed new footage on the screen. I thought they would be monsters. I expected them to kill without restraint. I want you all to look at this.
The screen showed a human marine, caked in grime, gently cradling a small dolphin child as he carried her from a burning building. The next clip showed human medics tending to wounded civilians before they saw to their own soldiers. A third showed human engineers helping to rebuild a destroyed hospital. "They fight like demons," Thesson declared, his voice full of conviction. "But they protect like angels." Every single field report from Doline Space confirms it. The humans were aggressive only when necessary and compassionate whenever possible. They adhered to the accepted rules of engagement, even when their enemy did not. They treated their prisoners humanely under galactic law. They prioritized civilian safety over their own strategic goals. He paused, letting the truth of his words settle over the stunned chamber. Perhaps it is time we stopped fearing them. Van was not convinced. One good deed does not erase 2 centuries of well-founded anxiety. "Then let us discuss the other issue," another counselor chimed in. He was from the Avish Collective, a species of master traders. For 200 years, Earth has been isolated by quarantine. All of their technology has been developed entirely on their own. Our intel says their weapons are, in some cases, light years ahead of what anyone else has. Their ships are tougher, and their soldiers are more lethal. If we keep them boxed in, they'll just get stronger, and our fear will keep growing with them. Ven couldn't believe what he was hearing. "Are you seriously suggesting we just lift the quarantine?" The Avish counselor shot back. "I'm suggesting we think about it, because the only thing scarier than a powerful species with a big military is a powerful species that feels trapped and backed into a corner. I would much rather have them as friends than as enemies who hate our guts." The argument went on and on. Thesson sank back into his chair, just watching it all happen. They could go at this for days, maybe even weeks, but he knew the choice was already made. Everyone in that room knew it. Earth had just proven they couldn't be contained. The only question left was whether the rest of the galaxy would be smart enough to welcome them, or foolish enough to get in their way. On the other side of the galaxy, in the massive throne room of the Kreveth Dominion, Emperor Vorith was staring at the battle reports. For a Kreveth, Vorith was ancient. He had seen 3 major wars and won 2 of them. He understood power, but more importantly, he knew when he was looking at something he could never hope to beat. The data from Drexen's fleet was crystal clear. The humans were better in almost every way you could imagine. "What were our final losses?" Vorith asked his war council, his voice barely a whisper. 7 capital ships, my emperor. About 300 support ships. Over 15,000 soldiers on the ground are either gone or captured. The councilman paused. "And the humans?" "They lost 5 soldiers in the ground fighting. 37 were injured. They didn't lose a single ship. A few got scraped up, but every last one of them is still running." Vorith closed his tired eyes. "Send a diplomat to Earth," he ordered. "Tell them the Dominion wants to talk about terms." One of his advisors looked totally confused. "Terms, my emperor?" "Peace terms, surrender terms, whatever they want to call them. We are not fighting these people. It's a fight we can't win." The room was dead silent. The Kreveth Dominion didn't surrender. They conquered. But Vorith had lived this long by knowing exactly when to walk away from the table. My Emperor, what about our honor? Our honor means nothing if our entire race gets wiped out, Vorith snapped. I've seen the videos. I know what their weapons are capable of. If we keep this up, they will come to our home world, and they will burn it to ash. We made a huge mistake when we attacked the Dolphin. We're going to fix that mistake right now, before it costs us literally everything. The meeting happened 3 days later at a neutral space station. Vorith sent his best negotiators, who walked in expecting the usual song and dance of galactic politics. Give up a little something, maybe trade some territory, pay a small fine. Captain Dan Reed, who was leading the human group, didn't waste time with small talk. He sat right down across from the Cravath and cut to the chase. Here's what we want, he said, his voice flat. A complete and immediate pullout from all Dolin territory. You will pay for every penny of the reconstruction costs. Any Cravath officers who broke galactic law will stand trial for war crimes. And you will give a formal public apology to the Dolin people. The lead Cravath negotiator just stared, completely stunned. Those terms are a bit much. Those terms are generous, Dan shot back. Your forces were committing genocide. By galactic law, we could ask for a whole lot more. We could have your entire leadership in a courtroom. The Council will never agree to terms this harsh. The Council had their shot to stop you. They sat back and did nothing. We stopped you. So, to be blunt, we don't really care what the Council thinks right now. Dan leaned in, his eyes locked on the negotiator. Here's what you need to get. Earth doesn't want your planets. We have zero interest in conquering you. We just want you to stop hurting people who can't defend themselves. You can either agree to these terms, or we will come to your home world and make you agree. The negotiator's face turned white. You'd invade our home? Only if you make us, Dan said, his voice calm. We would much rather have peace, but we are more than ready to fight if that's what it takes. The Cravath agreed to every last thing. Vorith had already told them to accept any deal that would stop the war. The humans were just too dangerous to mess with. News of the incredible agreement shot across the galaxy in just a few hours. The Cravath Dominion, one of the scariest military forces in the galaxy, had totally surrendered to a species most people hadn't even heard of a week before. The Galactic Council met again. This time there was no argument. The vote was quick and final. They officially lifted Earth's 200-year-old quarantine. They didn't really have another option. Trying to keep humanity locked up wasn't just impossible anymore. It was a catastrophically bad idea. Thesson flew to Dolin space to give Admiral Helen Cross the news himself. She was on the bridge of her flagship, watching over the huge rebuilding project. So that's it? We're free to go wherever we want now? Helen asked. Yes, Thesson confirmed. You have full access to Council space. You can make trade deals, join diplomatic missions, and be a part of all Council business. Thesson paused for a moment. But you should know, most species are still scared to death of you. Because we're good at fighting? Helen asked. Because you're good at everything you have to be, he corrected her. Fighting, protecting, building. You adapt in ways most of us can't even imagine. You didn't just survive on a death world that should have killed you, it made you stronger. Thesson looked out the window at the planet below, where human engineers were working right alongside Dolin construction crews.
The galaxy has never seen anyone like humanity. Some will hate you for it, others will look up to you for it, but I can promise you, none of us will ever forget what you did here." Helen kept her eyes on the planet, which was slowly but surely coming back to life. "We didn't do any of this to scare anyone," she said. "We did it because it was the right thing to do." "I know," Thesson said, "and that's what scares them the most. You're not conquerors. You're not just business people looking for a profit. You're idealists with the power to actually back up your ideals. The galaxy has no clue what to do with that." "They'll figure it out," Helen said with a small smile. "Or they won't. Either way, we're here now, and the next time someone out there needs help, we're going to be there to answer the call." Thesson flew back to the council headquarters. In his final report, he suggested that humanity be given full membership status. The vote passed, but just barely. Yet even as the council was voting, a flood of messages was already heading for Earth, messages from dozens of smaller species, all of them asking for an alliance. Imagine your whole world is burning, and the most powerful governments in the galaxy just, that's exactly what happened to my people. Then a distress signal reached a forgotten corner of space, and the one species everyone called monsters showed up to help. What happens when the only ones who can save you are the galaxy's biggest bogeymen? You're about to find out. In a single week, humanity's reputation did a complete 180. They went from being the scary boogeymen on a quarantined planet to the heroes who showed up when it counted, the ones who stood up for the little guy. As Admiral Cross sorted through a huge pile of new alliance requests, she couldn't help but smile. This was a game changer. 6 months, that's all it took. Walking through the rebuilt streets of his capital, Aaron was in awe. Human engineers had shared their amazing technology and hadn't asked for a single thing. Buildings that should have taken years to repair were already standing again. You could still see the scars from the war, but they were finally starting to heal. Today was a big day. He and his lead scientist, Lisa, had been invited to tour one of the human warships, the UES Valiant, which was Captain Reed's flagship. As their shuttle connected, Aaron stepped into a world he could barely wrap his head around. The inside of the ship was unbelievably massive, with hallways that looked like they went on forever. Everything was built to be useful, not to look pretty. There was no art, no fancy decorations, just clean, cold metal and an overwhelming sense of purpose. A man named Dan met them at the airlock. "Counselor Aaron, it's an honor to have you with us." "The honor is all ours, Captain," Aaron said back, his voice thick with emotion. "You saved our people. We owe you a debt we can never repay." Dan just looked a little uncomfortable with the praise. "We just did what anyone should have done," he said, quickly changing the topic. "Come on, I'll show you around." As they walked, Aaron watched the human crew. They all moved with a kind of speed and purpose that looked like it came from living on a planet with much higher gravity. They were a constant storm of efficient movement. Just watching them was almost exhausting. Lisa, of course, was asking 1,000,000 questions a minute. "How does your artificial gravity system work? What kind of fuel do your reactors use? What sort of shielding do you use against cosmic rays?" Dan answered every single question with a ton of patience. Some of their technology was so advanced it was like magic, but some of it was so simple it was almost chilling. For centuries, the galaxy had a file on humanity, filled with problems they said were impossible to solve. The humans just decided they weren't. Gazing down at his homeworld from the observation deck, Aaron saw a planet that was finally healing. The scorched continents were slowly turning green again. "I have to ask," Aaron said, breaking the silence. "Why did you do it? You owed us nothing. You didn't even know we existed until you picked up our distress call. Why risk everything for complete strangers?" Dan, the human captain, was quiet for a long moment. "Have you ever been truly alone? I mean, completely cut off because everyone in the universe is terrified of you?" Aaron could only shake his head. Earth was slapped with a galactic quarantine for 200 years. We were labeled too dangerous to contact. So we built our ships and trained our soldiers to protect the only people we had, ourselves. When we heard your call, we heard a voice in the dark that no one else was willing to answer. We remembered exactly what it felt like to be left for dead. Dan looked Aaron right in the eye. "We came because somebody had to. Because when you're scared, alone, and about to be wiped out, it shouldn't matter what you look like. When you scream for help, someone should answer." Beside Aaron, Lisa quietly wiped a tear from her cheek. "The old stories were true," she whispered in awe. "You really are guardians." "Just people," Dan said gently, trying to do the right thing. They spent another hour on the human ship, the Valiant. Dan showed them the med bay, where human doctors had already developed new techniques to treat his people's wounds. He walked them through the engine room, where human and Doline engineers were already sketching out new hybrid technologies, combining the best of both worlds. And then he took them to the memorial wall, a simple sheet of metal etched with the names of the 5 Marines who weren't going home. "We never forget a single one," Dan said, his voice thick with emotion. "Not one." On the shuttle ride back down to the planet's surface, Lisa's eyes went wide as she stared at her data pad. "The human government just sent over a formal proposal," she gasped. "It's a full mutual defense treaty, military alliance, technology sharing, even cultural exchange programs. What do we do?" Aaron couldn't help but smile. "I think," he said, "we sign it before they change their minds. The humans are the best friends this galaxy has ever seen." The treaty was signed 1 week later, the first official alliance between humanity and an alien species. President Garcia of Earth came herself, joined by Admiral Cross and Captain Reed. The entire ceremony was broadcast live across both their worlds. "Today, we forge a bond born in the fires of conflict," President Garcia announced to the cheering crowds. "The Doline called for help, and Earth answered. Now we promise to always stand together, to shield one another, and to build a brighter future for all of us." Aaron's hands trembled just a little as he signed the historic document. Lisa stood beside him, representing their entire scientific community. The moment it was official, the square erupted in a joyous roar. It was a stunning sight. Doline and humans, celebrating not just their survival, but the birth of a new hope. The ripple effect was almost immediate. Soon other species began reaching out to Earth. First came the scrappy traders of the Helan Federation, then the peaceful farmers of the Avish Collective, and even the isolated mining colonies on the outer rim. They all had one thing in common. They were tired of being bullied or ignored by the major galactic powers.
and they all wanted what the Dolin now had, a partner and a protector in Earth. Admiral Cross suddenly found herself commanding a whole new kind of fleet, dubbed the Terran Defense Initiative. It was no longer just human ships, it was a patchwork quilt of vessels from a dozen different species. They ran drills together, they patrolled trade routes side by side, and they quickly became a symbol of something the galaxy hadn't seen before. A coalition built not on power or profit, but on the simple idea that the strong should protect the vulnerable. The Galactic Council watched all this with a mix of fascination and alarm. Some were relieved that the Terran Defense Initiative was bringing stability to chaotic regions. Others grew nervous as Earth's influence spread like wildfire. But nobody could deny the results. Space piracy rates dropped to historic lows. Petty border conflicts that had simmered for generations were suddenly being resolved at negotiating tables with human mediators. Thesson, the Council's top diplomat, visited Earth for the first time since the quarantine was lifted. He toured the world that had haunted the galaxy's nightmares for centuries. He saw the impossible cities they had built in a brutally hostile environment. He looked upon towering mountains and raging oceans that would make most species physically sick. He saw a world that had done everything in its power to crush its children and had utterly failed. President Garcia met him in a garden that, by all rights, shouldn't exist. The gravity was heavy enough to be a constant strain, and the weather was a chaotic, unpredictable mess. But it was breathtakingly beautiful. "So," Garcia began with a slight smile, "are you convinced we're not monsters yet?" "I was never convinced you were monsters, Madam President," Thesson replied honestly. "I was afraid of what you might become if you decided to be." He looked up at the planet's piercingly blue sky. "I understand now. I see why you fight so hard. This world taught you that strength is the key to survival. But it also taught you that survival alone isn't enough. You need a family, a purpose. You need something worth protecting." "We're a long way from perfect," Garcia admitted. "We've made more than our share of mistakes, and I'm sure there are plenty more to come." "But you try," Thesson cut in. "That's what matters. You see an injustice, and you act. You see suffering, and you help. The galaxy has been missing that for a very, very long time." They finished their stroll in a comfortable silence. Later that evening, Thesson filed his official report. His recommendation was short and clear. Welcome humanity into the galactic community with open arms. They've earned their seat at the table. Far away on a lonely monitoring post in the deep black, a new alarm began to shriek. A distress beacon had just lit up. It was from a species called the Thenari. They were getting hammered by raiders. Their defenses were moments from collapsing, and they were begging for anyone to help. The emergency alert sliced through Admiral Cross's routine as she was deep in fleet deployment charts. She scanned the message, her eyes widening slightly before reading it a second time, just to be sure. The Thenari system. A 3-week burn, even at full throttle. There wasn't a moment's hesitation. Her orders cut through the ship's comms with cold clarity. Scramble every available vessel. Full and immediate deployment. We've got people in trouble. Within hours, the Terran Defense Initiative was a river of steel pouring into the void. Human battleships were the core, but this was something new. Sleek Dolin cruisers flanked them, massive Avish haulers brought up the rear, and nimble Helian scouts darted between them all.
It was an armada of a dozen different species, united for a single purpose. Watching from the bridge of the Valiant, Dan could hardly believe the sight. This force was bigger, more diverse, and packed a heavier punch than the fleet that saved the Dolene home world. It was the physical proof of a message now rippling through the galaxy. When you call for help, someone will come. Just before the jump, President Garcia's face appeared on every screen in the fleet. Her voice reached every crew member, human or otherwise. "Let's be clear," she stated, her tone unshakable. "We are not going as conquerors. We are going as guardians. We're not doing this for glory or territory. We're doing it because it's the right thing to do. We're going because someone is crying out for help, and we will not let them be swallowed by the darkness alone. This is our identity. This is the choice we make. Earth and our allies standing for those who can no longer stand for themselves." Then the fleet vanished into the silent brilliance of faster-than-light travel. And far behind them, Earth continued its quiet, peaceful spin around its home star.
That small blue marble, once the galaxy's boogeyman, was now becoming the heart of something new, something better. From his office window, Aaron watched the fleet's energy trails fade into the night sky. Lisa stood beside him, tracking their departure. "They're really going to do this every single time, aren't they?" Lisa asked, her voice filled with wonder. "Every distress call, every species in trouble." "Yes," Aaron said softly, "because that's who they are. The galaxy is changing because of them. In fact, it already has." In the silent, endless dark between the stars, the combined fleet pushed onward, a beacon of light heading for another world that needed them. They carried powerful weapons and advanced technology, true, but their most important cargo was something far greater. They carried hope. The hope that when you hit rock bottom, when all is lost and the shadows are closing in, someone is coming. You see, on a little blue world they called Earth, a stubborn race of people, forged in endless hardship, had figured out a fundamental truth. They learned that the greatest power in the universe wasn't being a conqueror who takes whatever they want. It was being a guardian who protects what they have. And so humanity, the legendary Deathworlders from the planet of nightmares, finally found their place among the stars. They were the ones who answered the call, and because they did, the galaxy would never be the same again.